Treason is not the reason for the season. Episode 7, Summary of Ratified Documents, Federal Law and Actions of the President. The previous videos give 6 clear historical items showing the position of the founders as a whole and the foundational documents of our nation as a whole with regard to militias, rebellions, and the bearing of arms. First, the Declaration of Independence was intended to declare the American Revolution as a legitimate revolt, that the U.S. was a legitimate government, in order to get support from foreign powers, most specifically, King Louis of France. It stated that government has a duty to protect people's basic rights, and when it fails to the point of abject despotism, the people may throw off that government. It was not meant to endorse or enable anonymous civilians stockpiling anonymous guns to overthrow democracy whenever they disagreed with the outcome of an election. This Declaration of Independence was signed by 56 founders in the Continental Congress. Second, the Articles of Confederation, ratified by the nation says, for the defense of such state, every state shall always keep up a well-regulated and disciplined militia. Militias were not intended to be anonymous civilians hoarding anonymous weapons ready to overthrow democracy when it voted for something they didn't like. Militias were intended to be supplements to the full-time army, on call by the government to defend the state. Third, the Constitution Convention was spurred by Shays' Rebellion to design a much stronger federal government to be able to put down by force insurrections such as Shays'. The founders did not design militias to be a way for anonymous civilians to hoard anonymous guns to take up armed revolt. The Constitution defined armed insurrection as treason, and Article 2 clearly states militias shall operate under and subservient to their commander-in-chief, the President. The military is not to meddle in politics. Militias are not intended to be anonymous terrorist groups that overthrow the government when they don't like it. The Constitution was ratified by the nation. Fourth, the Second Amendment makes clear that militias are to be citizen soldiers, registered and trained during times of peace, who would be drafted by the government in times of war to defend the state. The Second Amendment starts out by saying, a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state. The founders didn't declare armed insurrection to be treason and militias subservient to the President in the Constitution just to declare in the Second Amendment that militias could be anonymous paramilitary groups operating outside the law so they can launch an insurrection whenever wanted. When the Second Amendment concludes the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed, it is talking about the right to bear arms as it relates to maintaining state militias, under the command of the President, to defend the state. It is not talking about anonymous civilians hoarding unregistered weapons to overthrow the state. The wording for the Second Amendment is explicit and intentional. When the Bill of Rights was being drafted, the states had their own constitutions that had existed since the Declaration of Independence. 10 states had no right to bear arms at all, or only a right to bear arms under militia service only. Only 2 states had a constitution that enumerated a personal right to armed self-defense. The different approaches by the states to the bearing of arms were known when the Bill of Rights was being drafted. The ramifications of the different wordings were known. The wording to protect a personal right to armed self-defense was known by the founders, and rejected for the Federal Bill of Rights. The wording that was accepted and ratified by the nation only protected a right to bear arms for militia service only. States that had no right to bear arms in their constitutions, states that regulated arms and gunpowder, states that regulated open and concealed carry, could continue these regulations. The only change they needed to make was to allow for and regulate how people would maintain their arms for militia service. The Second Amendment was ratified by the nation. Fifth, 1 year after the Second Amendment was ratified, the Militia Act of 1792 made absolutely and undeniably clear that the Second Amendment was intended to create militias regulated by the state to be drafted by the government to defend the state. All able-bodied men were required to register for militia service. Anonymous civilians stockpiling anonymous guns was not their intent. And the Militia Act states one reason the President can call up a militia is to put down insurrections. Militias were never intended to overthrow the government. They were intended to operate under the government to defend the state. States that had no right to bear arms in their constitutions, states that regulated arms and gunpowder, states that regulated open and concealed carry, could continue these regulations. The only change they needed to make was to allow for and regulate how people would maintain their arms for militia service. And with the Federal Militia Act of 1792, the arms and ammunition protected by the Second Amendment in the Federal Bill of Rights was made explicit. States with no right to bear arms, or a right to bear arms for militia service only, had to allow militia members to possess 1 musket and 24 shot for federal militia service. These states could regulate all other arms, from what arms were legal within the state, to whether or not the state allowed open or concealed carry, to how arms were stored when not in use. And in times of peace, when the militia was not active, these states could regulate how militia members stored and carried their arms for militia service. The Militia Act is passed by Congress and becomes the law of the land. 6th, George Washington put all of these ideas into direct and unequivocal action as president when he called up a massive militia from many states and marched them to Pennsylvania to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. All 6 of these historical items were undertaken by the founders and the nation as a whole. The Declaration of Independence was signed by 56 founding fathers and Continental Congress. The Articles of Confederation were ratified by the nation. The Constitution was ratified by the nation. The Second Amendment was ratified by the nation. The Militia Act of 1792 was passed by Congress and signed by President Washington to become law of the land. And then President George Washington, acting as Commander-in-Chief, called upon several states to provide a massive militia to crush the Whiskey Rebellion. The founders intended the Second Amendment only to protect a right to bear arms for militia service. States with no right to bear arms or a right to bear arms for militia service only, could regulate arms outside the arms needed for militia service as they saw fit. Nearly 1 century later, the Supreme Court unanimously supported this interpretation. In the Cruikshank v. U.S. case of 1875, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled. The Second Amendment declares that it shall not be infringed, but this, as has been seen, means no more than that it shall not be infringed by Congress. This is one of the amendments that has no other effect than to restrict the powers of the national government. The Cruikshank ruling made explicit that the Second Amendment only protects a right to bear arms as it relates to militia service. All other rights to the bearing of arms are left to the states to interpret as they choose. And most state constitutions have either no right to bear arms at all, or only a right to bear arms for militia service only. When militia as terrorism extremists try to pretend that the Founding Fathers are lurkers who support them in email, they generally ignore the totality of these nationally ratified documents. These extremists try to quote the "shall not be infringed" part of the Second Amendment, completely out of context, trying to argue that registering for militia service was never the Founders' intent, trying to argue that anonymous civilians stockpiling unregistered guns to overthrow the government whenever they see fit was somehow the Founders' intentions. Militia as terrorism extremists also try to show the Founders support them in email by trying to quote some personal letters out of context, or completely fabricate a personal quote. But the founding of the United States first and foremost gets its design and intention from the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, all of which were hammered out by the Founders as a collective and ratified by the entire nation. And what the Founders as a whole agreed to, those documents make clear that militias were to be subservient to the government, regulated and registered by the government, to be called up by the government to defend the state. Those who suggest the militia as terrorism view, those who suggest that the Founders wanted militias to be private, anonymous, and ready to overthrow the government, those people are advocating for legal lunacy. They are arguing that the Second Amendment guarantees them the right to commit the highest crime in the Constitution, treason. It would be like the founding documents guaranteeing the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and then some extremist arguing that the First Amendment right to freedom of speech guarantees them the right to threaten to murder someone. Taking up arms against the government is treason. Therefore, the Second Amendment should not be taken in any way to guarantee people the right to commit treason. Nor should the Second Amendment be taken in any way to guarantee people the right to prepare to commit treason. Nothing in the Second Amendment promises a right to private militias, operating anonymously and outside government control, training, and preparing to overthrow the government. Militias are not private, they operate under their commander-in-chief, the President. They are subservient to the government. Militias are not anonymous, they require registration so that the states can train militia members, and they require registration specifically so that their commander-in-chief can activate them for militia service. If Billy Bob Hayseed isn't registered, there is no way for the state to be able to call upon him for militia service, there is no way for the state to train him, there is no way for the state to place him under the command of the commander-in-chief if the president activates the militia. Militias are not intended for overthrowing our own government. The founding documents say over and over that militias are for defense of state, for security of state, from the Articles of Confederation, to the Constitution, to the Second Amendment, to the Militia Act of 1792. The founders reacted with horror to Shays' rebellion to the point that months later, the Constitutional Convention had defined overthrowing the government as treason. The Second Amendment specifically calls out militias being for the security of the state. The Militia Act of 1792 explicitly states one reason the president can activate the militia is to put down internal rebellions. And then George Washington, as president, used the Constitution, the Second Amendment, and the Militia Act of 1792, to put together a massive militia to crush the Whiskey Rebellion. What the militia as terrorism traitors are arguing is an insult to the Declaration of Independence, an insult to the Constitution, an insult to the Bill of Rights, and an insult to the decades of work the founders did to bring this nation together under a design that has managed to last 2.5 centuries. And the militia as terrorism traitors want you to think the founders intended mayhem, that the founders intended terrorism, that the founders intended something insanely preposterous, that militias were intended to be private, anonymous, groups operating outside the government, ready to overthrow the government. One can imagine every single delegate who signed the Constitution, every single state legislature who ratified the Bill of Rights, every congressman and senator who passed the Militia Act of 1792, and President Washington himself, must be spinning in their graves at this traitorous militia as terrorism nonsense being passed off in their names. Enough of this insanity. Nowhere in the design of the United States government do private civilians have a right to commit treason. Nowhere in the design of the U.S. government do people have a right to anonymously stockpile anonymous armories full of unregistered weapons to overthrow the government because they don't like an election outcome, or some tax law, some grazing law, or some legitimate election. Nowhere. Levying war against the U.S. is defined in the Constitution as treason. And the Second Amendment does not override the Constitution and guarantee Billy Bob Hayseed the right to commit treason. The right to bear arms only exists in support of a militia that operates under the President, with mandatory registration to allow government control and government activation, to suppress insurrections and repel invasions. That was the founders' intentions. The Second Amendment in no way was intended to encourage treason, in no way was intended to encourage and enable anonymous civilians to stockpile unregistered guns to overthrow their own democratic government. Treason is not the reason for the Second Amendment. Treason is not the reason for the season.